I'm Gary Byrne. I'm the author of Crisis of Character and Secrets of the Secret Service. And I'm also with me is my co-writer, Grant Schmidt. And he's not just my co-writer. He's my friend. I've known him for a long time. He's also does my social media. He does everything that electronic for me. He also does some scheduling for me quite a bit. Anyway, he's my left hand and right hand man sometimes. So we are basically what we're going to discuss today, and correct me if I'm wrong, Grant, we're going to talk about the writing process and more accurately our writing process and what was a train wreck and what works. And I've actually been giving it a lot of thought since we talked yesterday. And it's one of the first things I want to say is just because when you're doing something with the writing process, just because it seems cumbersome, don't throw it out right away. You know what I mean? Like, and for us, the writing process is two people writing. It was, the first book was Crisis of Character, and it was my personal life story, my memoir, and my friend Grant helped me write it. And
that book, just as a background, I mean, that book was, as a background, you were former Secret Service, never a writer, never, a writing career. Me, I was a film major in college, and then I had my own little film company, small business that made small films, commercials and things for small businesses and nonprofits. And then come around December 2014, wrote you a sample chapter, and you did not like the proposition of writing a memoir of your life, but your wife said you had to do it, and you had a great story, and a lot of people had a lot of great stories that also were not writers as a background. Coming from film, I had written for film, so there were some congruencies there. And your first book took off. It was a New York Times bestseller for 11 weeks. You have the plaque somewhere in the house. I also have the plaque somewhere in the house. It sold 500,000 copies. It's still selling.
Roughly.
You can get them roughly, more or less, give or take. Who can count after that? And then,
yes.
And it's still selling.
Yeah.
I have a few books here that you just signed, and I have to wrap them and put your note in them and send them. And so then we did Secrets of the Secret Service, which would have done so much better if not for the book Fire and Fury, which that when it came out ended up being like completely debunked on its face when it launched, but it sort of subverted our launch. But Secrets of the Secret Service is still selling, and they're both sort of time capsules and timeless, and they've both had a huge impact. So, I mean, I've seen it firsthand at your events. You get so many questions of like from prior service members, especially people in government, and they want to know, how can they write their book? So, what advice would you give them? Let's get into it.
The first thing I would tell you is you have to avoid yourself of the fear of I shouldn't do it or couldn't do it or I can't do it. So let's start with the physical. Let's start with it.
That took a while.
Yeah. Let's start with the individual writer or storyteller, because I'm the storyteller. Now, I never thought of myself like that, but our business manager and Grant's mother is the one that first said that when they were talking to me about this. And I don't necessarily agree with her wholehearted analogy that I'm a great storyteller, but I enjoy telling a story. So but don't get wrapped up on what your writing skills are, because here's what my writing skills were then and still are. I'm a cop. I write who, where, when, why, how. I have the ability to stretch artistically about that far. I just don't have that kind of writing skills. But what I am is honest. I have a good memory, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I enjoyed telling the story. I especially enjoy telling the stories when it involves other people, because I'm always amazed about my coworkers, my former coworkers from the Air Force, from the Secret Service, from the Air Marshal Service. Those are the three jobs that gave me a 29-year career with the federal government. And I'm always amazed by them. And I humbly say to you that I'm always grateful for every one of them, because they taught me so much. These people are so incredible. I was grateful to work with any of them. So this back to the skill part. don't let your limitations, I have serious ADD and dyslexia, don't let those things think that can slow you down. You need to find somebody like Grant, or there's software out there too. But for me, it never would have worked without somebody like Grant. And I'll be honest with you, it may have never worked right without Grant. And I say that because I mentioned earlier that I think I mentioned earlier that I've known Grant a long time, since he was a young child, because so I'm friends with his parents. I remember Grant from the very beginning. I never saw this kid without a camera in his hand, a VCR camera. And back then, the camera that he had in his hand was enormous. You know, it wasn't like the stuff we have today. Right. And he always,
shoulder launcher.
and there was always these funny stories about Grant and this camera. And I remember telling my wife one day, I said, someday we're going to be watching TV, an award show, and Grant's going to be up there with that goofy look on his face, accepting an award. And I said, I'm telling you, he's a good kid. They're good people. He's a storyteller. And this is way before we ever thought about writing a book. And just to, Grant kind of touched on the fact that I was apprehensive about writing the book. Let me clarify that. Myself and my wife were adamantly against it at first, until we read the first 3 chapters that Grant had taken my story, massaged it a little bit. I threw a lot of it out. That is part of the process. That's important for you to understand. I mean, in some cases, Grant would give me material, and literally I threw it all out.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, so much is thrown out. And in terms of my writing process, I would sit down and stare at a blank page, and I would know that probably the first 3 pages would get cut out wholesale, and I would have to just push past that incredibly painful writing process of writing that first 3 pages, knowing that I'm probably going to throw out those first 3 pages, but those 3 pages got me to the core or the crux of what we were getting at, and so then. I draft something, and that might seem kind of backwards, but I always feel that a first draft is always better than no draft, because in no draft, you're just in an abyss. You're in a vacuum. It would be me and you talking, and we'd be going in all different directions and stuff. And then I would go back, and I would draft something. And I'm not you. I'm not former Secret Service. So I would draft something that would come to you, and you would be like, wow, this is so Hollywood. This is such BS. Like I remember and we made a joke out of it. Like I would say like, and then you're diffusing a bomb, and you'd have to be like, hey, whoa, I had never diffused any bombs. Like you don't have to add to it. Sometimes it's just,
right.
Sometimes like the simmering coals of it are more powerful than like, over the top fireworks. And I remember in one particular instance, as an example, was the motorcade. The story was Bill Clinton's motorcade is moving through, and they broke all the rules. And because of that, a Secret Service person got severely injured because, President Clinton wanted to sort of do it his way and not the tactical way. And when we wrote that story, I just had to write how I kind of thought the Secret Service would run a motorcade. And that sort of gave you the initial draft to say, well, that's wrong. And then I would say, how is that wrong? And then we would break it down. And and that's why I have these guys, which are probably familiar. And these are just from Secrets of the Secret Service. And these are just the notes. And I was sort of paging through it. And some of them I can't show, because some of them have like the acronyms of the people you interviewed.
All right.
But I mean, this was literally like the Bible that we operated on, and the majority of the problem is just organizing the thoughts. And that was a huge problem for us, was just organizing the thoughts into a structure.
So I want
to chronology.
Yeah, I want to reiterate again. When I talked about my saving grace with this was Grant, and that's one of the things Grant brought to this was organization, because when it comes to the thought process, my organization skills don't really exist too well, not without some outside help. And what I mean by that is like sit down and make a list. Again, when everybody's seen the joke about, hey, what are you doing today? Oh, look, squirrel, and that's the way my mind works. with the exception of when I'm doing something like when it comes to my work or my trade, I do have great focus. Grant gave us great focus in this, and he organized things. He's got many notepads and books, and that's how he kept us organized.
And I just gave you one. I just gave you the Crisis of Character ones because it had your whole family history and your family tree and so much excess knowledge and stuff. I had to give it to you. It didn't make sense to keep in my house.
Yeah,
your family will have that as heirloom.
It's kind of right. It is a neat set of materials, and I have some other stuff too. I have the first draft that you did of the book back when we wrote twice as much as we needed to per contract, but whatever. So
yeah, literally.
And we'll talk about that. Maybe we'll talk about that in another.
Well, in terms of organization, I mean, working back from advice to the person who says, Gary, I want to write the book. What should I do? I would say first, there's some hard and fast rules you got to operate on. 80,000 words, period, end of story. Not 85, not 85,000. It's 80,000 words, period, and that amounts into, a book about this size. The idea pages. There is that a lot of book sales, physical, tangible book sales, are made in the airport and places of travel. So it's got to be light enough that someone can take it with them. And it pains me to this day to see books that are twice as big because I'm like, well, what's so great about what they're doing? That they get to write. And it's normally because they're a college professor or something and they got some sort of grant and they have some sort of academic clout. But publishers recognize, head over heels now, that does not that kind of clout doesn't translate into sales. Demand translates into sales. And so it's 80,000 words, no ifs, ands, or buts. It better be a finished manuscript by the time they look at it. They will never read it. And if our publishers are listening to this, we like you very much. Yes. But it's always a love-hate relationship, and they will never read it. So
I'm not sure I would call it love-hate, but so one of the things they taught. Here's a couple quick things, and it kind of reiterates some of the things Grant said. This is what we learned about the writing business. Was like Grant said, the book that he showed you is that through about 300 pages roughly, which is about 80,000 words. The average person at night or when they're sitting down to read can read between 3,000 and 5,000 words before they're either distracted or tired. So that's why you were looking for a book of about 300 pages. And don't, like Grant said, 80,000 words and stop. If you stop at 70,000 words, that's fine.
Oh, it's probably better.
I would promise you that you have, in your writing process, you can come up with 10 to 20,000 extra words that they're in your notes, they're in your head. It's not hard to add, it's hard to subtract. Because when you subtract stories and stuff, you get out of sequence, you get out of line, stuff doesn't look right. And Grant and I have had this problem a lot. Oh, sure. And we certainly experienced, we took Crisis of Character and we turned it into a screenplay. And I'm still editing it. At times, we've been working on it for a couple of years. When you edit something, you go back and read it. You're like, this doesn't make sense because I edited something out and didn't, So anyway, you get the point that I'm making.
Well, but, so I do want to chime in because you just reminded me. There's some key bits of advice, some like phrases that are key bits of advice that people will come across and they need to hear. Which is one, you want to write from your backyard. So I'm a writer, but, and people say, oh, you authored that book, and I have to stop them. And I have to say, no, I'm not the author of Crisis of Character. I'm the character, even though my name's on it. But you, Gary, are the author. And people say, well, what's the difference? And that goes into the biggest piece of advice, which is write from your own backyard. So if I want to write a book about drug dealers and you show me the money, no, you show me the cash. Well, I better be a drug dealer or DEA or something to write that book. And if I'm not, then I just need to recognize that that's not the book for me to write. I mean, there's exceptions like Tom Clancy and stuff. Tom Clancy wasn't a real life James Bond, but that's where he came in and he was amazing. But everyone's trying to be the next Jack Reacher novelist or the Tom Clancy novelist. And the biggest advice is always going to be to write from your own backyard. Now, if you are a former, prior service member and you're literally writing your memoir and you're writing from your backyard, that's fantastic because to bring in those key realistic details, and people will have a hard time disputing it because of your service. And the truth is always stranger than fiction, and that's why it's always so cool. But you do have the problem of where you may need someone like me, you may not, and right from your own backyard, the 80,000 words. Oh, that's so another thing is stylistically, my style comes from the advice I got, which was show, don't tell. And for the screenplay that really came out, where we're trying to write something and we're trying to show people what happened, get rid of as much dialogue as possible so that the dialogue really pops and stands out, but show, don't tell. And in the book format, a few people on the Amazon reviews actually said that. They go, it kind of shows you what's going on, sort of shows you the action. And as a writing style for me, I have to first tell, then show, and then I have to cut out all of the tell parts. I mean, when we were writing Secrets of the Secret Service, we tried to include every death of the Secret Service history, every operative, agent, and officer. And it became too much. There was like 36 or 50 of them, and it became too much of a tall order to adequately and accurately do in a service to them and simultaneously stick to the word count. So, I mean, by the time you put the time, the who, what, when, where, and why, and the date and the time, and the, was it humid? What kind of, what did it feel like? Was it cold out? All that stuff. I mean, man, you're several hundred words in. What were they wearing? Did they have standard issue pistols at the time? Or were they all just, buying whatever they could get and practicing all them themselves and stuff? And by that time, before you actually get to the crux of the story, which is the death, and then how the Secret Service evolved afterwards, you're several hundred words in just to explain what the hell's going on. And we had to give up that goal. But still the modern day writing style is to show, don't tell, and that'll make your dialogue really pop. If your writing is very dialogue heavy, you're doing something wrong. And if you're giving a lot of explanation, dates, times, places, you're writing a Wikipedia page. You're not writing, a compelling book. And I mean, that was the most tough thing for me. And my wife would say to me all the time, "You're chasing the rabbit." And in terms of history books, one of the biggest problems I had was when you're doing history, and you're always doing history if you're writing a memoir, if you're writing nonfiction, is recognizing that the book that you may be reading, so we read every book on the Secret Service leading up to the second book. We split them in half. You took half, I took half. Yeah. And some of them were out of print. That was insane. But those were primary sources. So some of those things are not quite there, but they're the primary source. That person lived that. Right. And then of the secondary sources, you have to be very careful of news clippings and such. They're often summarizing primary and secondary sources. So there would be so many times where I'm trying to reconcile, you get that, National Geographic Secret Service book or something like that. Right. And they have truncated information so much to the point that it's now wrong. Yeah. The guns aren't right, or the uniforms aren't right, or how many shots were fired, that kind of thing weren't right. And I mean, from the Kennedy assassination to the attack on the Blair House, there was conflicting primary information. And as a writer, that was my biggest problem. That was my biggest problem.
So one of the things that I'm taking basically from what you just said is, if we were going to name this podcast, the name of it would be Right From Your Backyard. Yeah. And two, to the audience, I would say basically what Grant just said over the last couple of minutes is why I was lucky for him to come to me. I mean, Grant wasn't the first person to ever come to me and ask me to do something like this. And I never considered it. I mean, when I was in the Secret Service, when it was happening, after it happened, even before. When I say it happened, and what I'm talking about is my unfortunate claim to fame was I was the first person in the history of the Secret Service to ever be forced to testify against the president he was protecting. I had to testify against President Clinton in his impeachment scandal. But even before that, I would come to meet people at times, especially when I was in tours, and they'd say, "Hey, I'm writing a book about something, would you be interested?" And I would say, no, I would never thought about talking about these things. And again, not until Grant had the first 3 chapters and a forward, and I completely flipped. And when my wife read it, she completely flipped. But back to the writing style, and and I know you've heard this terminology before, but I'll use it again. Don't get wrapped around the axle. I'm very controlling at times, and I had to learn in the beginning, and I actually had to say this to Grant, and I had to say it to him more than one time, not because he needed to hear it, because I was reminding myself. I had to give Grant some artistic freedom. Everything had to be accurate. We had a couple caveats, always musts and nevers, and always must were things like it had to be true. I had final say, and if I tell you
Yes.
to, and Grant was really good about this. He's really good about a lot of things that I don't know if I've ever given him credit for, but I put a lot of pressure on him with these things, and we worked lots of hours together. He did, for every hour that we worked together, he probably spent 5 hours on his own fixing it or coming up with it.
Oh,
Even, I mean,
the
for every
second book was insane. I mean, the
oh, it
first book
was
was insane. To give people an
yeah.
idea, the first book was an insane. I wrote that first chapter in December 2014, and I was doing other work. Um, this is just. I'm going to summarize
Hi,
this as
Remy.
quickly as I can. Wife in the background. So December 2014, because we recognized a demand that people would buy such a book that was about the Clintons leading up to the 2016 elections. Whether you like it or not, this is the writing advice, and
Right.
we recognized that there would be a huge demand, to have that sort of inner circle memoir. And so December 2014, first chapter. Then there was a lot of back and forth. We started doing interviews over the course of weeks. You were still a federal air marshal at the time,
Well,
so you're still traveling.
when you say interviews, you mean interviewing me?
I'm interviewing you. Yeah, you would come to
Yeah,
the
yeah,
office
not
and
other
we would
people.
talk. And
Yeah,
you were doing the interviews at
right.
first as a way to convince me to
Not
stop.
to.
Stop poking the bear.
Right.
And as I'm doing the interviews, my other staff in the office, who
Yeah.
I liked very, very much, they were great people.
Yeah.
But one in particular, said flat out to me that you were
A liar.
a liar, and
I
it
think he.
created a terrible working environment where I had to challenge him, because I'm like, dude, if you know there's an inaccuracy, I need to know about that, because then I have to clarify it. Like, if you were indeed a liar, then I could not
Right.
put my name on the project or do the project.
No.
So we had this long meeting where I basically showed him the legal depositions and the C-SPAN stuff, and it turns out that he was working off of false information, and but he still felt very strongly that he didn't like the content of the project. And that's when there did come a point for me where I had to shut down I had to end and shut down the other projects, let them run their course, and not get new business, and basically had to let those 2 people go, because I was completely dedicated to the project. Even though we did have a benefactor who was funding the project, but it was
Right.
just really floating the project. It wasn't
Right.
I wasn't profiting anything off of
Right.
writing it. It was all based on the idea that there would be an agent and a publisher, and then and then royalties for the book. But there was no promise, there was no guarantee
No.
of it.
No.
And
And it
so
almost slipped away a couple times.
Oh yeah, it was really. So then we wrote a 160,000 word manuscript, of which they read it. The agents read it. They came up with, but we came up with bullet points to sell to the publisher, and we were operating under the misunderstanding that at some point in the game, the agents and the publisher would tell us to chop it down, what exactly they wanted out of it, because they could sort of read the room. And we didn't really get that memo. And right as we're going about to print, they're like, holy crap, it's 160,000 words. we need 80,000. We were told 80,000. And we were like, okay. Like, you know, and there was a period of time where we gave it to him for a month and we never heard back from him. And then we're about to go to print. And then all of a sudden all hell broke loose. We almost lost it then. And then there was a 3-week period. We had to hire another person who was an absolute professional. A book doctor. That's right.
Yeah.
A book doctor to save the whole thing. Because this is as new to me as it was to you.
Yeah.
And then we brought it down to that 80,000 words, got everything straight. Your rules still had to apply.
And they did.
You know, and nothing they did. Thank God that they still applied. He didn't trunk. That was my big concern. Is he going to try and truncate something, you know, to where all of a sudden the people in the room were different people, or 2 scenes become 1 scene, and that kind of, you know, nonsense. And so thank God it didn't happen. He's an amazing guy. And then the book got published, does very well, does gangbusters. Second book, completely different story. That was, by the time the contracts, and we were paid, because we weren't going to work if we weren't going to get paid. By the time the contracts were signed and everything was set, we had 3 months to write an 80,000 word book. If you do that math, it is absolutely insane. I was working 17-hour days. I'm writing on the treadmill so that I'm not completely sedentary. And it was just, and that was you had to compile all the research and all the stuff, and the publisher does not care. The publisher does not care how hard you have to work or how insane a deadline is. They truly don't care. So both books had opposite kind of problems, and that's just sort of the politics of it. So really, if you're going the standard route, you're got to complete a manuscript, then you have to get it to an agent. You have to sell it to an agent, and then they have to sign on to it. They get their fee, and then from the agent, they sell it to the publisher, and then the publisher may give you an advance, but it's very rare nowadays. And then they go to publish, and they're sort of doing the shotgun method. So it's totally up to you to do the advertising and marketing, and they'll put some money into it for print and things like that, like old school. But you got it. They expect you to do the new school, the social media, things like that. And then it goes to print, and it either does well or does not do well. But the books that do well cover the books that don't do well, basically. So it is a tough business, and all this advice we're giving is kind of work because we're out of it, right, Gary? It's not going to be a third book, right?
Probably not. No. So two things I want to take from that and tell the listeners is, there's 2 times when I was stunned in a positive way. Yeah, we're going to wrap this up quickly. There was 2 times when I was stunned in a positive way, actually 3 times, which was one, when Grant gave us his first 3 chapters, and my wife, literally almost tears in her eyes, was so impressed with his writing ability. And it wasn't his writing ability at first. It was the writing ability that he morphed into. And when he really got to the point where he could weed out his natural ability to expand on things, and he narrowed things down, and he really got a good style. Then when we had to I had great concerns when we hired the book doctor, because I didn't want 2 things.
You're like giving up your baby.
Well, it wasn't my baby. I knew the story would stay my story, but what I didn't want to lose was your panache, your style, because you had worked so hard. And then when he sent us back that first material, literally I was in tears, because it was my story, your writing style, our story together. And this guy, basically the way I would define what he did was he took it took me 37 words to say. He narrowed it down to 17 words. And he did it in such a great way. He was a history writer, to the point where, I don't know if you remember this, but I had a conversation with him one time. He sends me an email. I'll make this quick. He sends me an email to ask me some questions. And I email him back, and I say, clearly you have not gotten to the part of the book where I have ADD and dyslexia. Please do this by phone. My phone will be on 24 hours a day. I will not waste your time. Just tell me what you need. I'll give you the answer. You hang up on me. So he called me up and he goes, I don't understand. I said, it takes me 40 minutes to write 4 lines on a computer. I'm wasting time. I'm wasting your time. Do it by phone. When you've got the answers, hang up on me. Don't listen. Don't let me drag this out. So that's what we did. And he thought that was funny. But it worked. And, but one of the first things he got caught up on was, he wasn't a firearms guy, and that would catch him. But,
and that's something that we were so worried about, because when you're prior service and you're writing, because that the book is going to go through the gauntlet, and I'm a writer, I'm not the editor, right?
The hardest judging.
I'm not the editor. So it goes from your mind to mine. I write it. It goes back to you. It goes back and forth between us. And then it does go to agent, publisher, editor, and there might be two editors. Yeah. And, that it's so true that, all of a sudden they'll change caliber. They'll change, some sort of technical detail.
They'll say,
and that one technical detail, it's the same thing. No, a 380 is not a 38 special. You will really lose people very quickly. A 40 cal is not a 45 ACP, and you will so quickly lose people if you say something like, "Oh, and back then they carried the Tommy gun chambered in 40 cal." Oh. You'll lose people. People will be like, "Oh, this guy's completely full of it." Yeah. And you see it in the movies all the time, but in the books it's the same thing.
And that was one of the caveats, was because I knew when we wrote, especially the first book and the second book to a certain extent, that I would be judged heavily and hard by my former coworkers, and I was prepared for it. With the first book, I probably wasn't really completely prepared for it until we were almost done, and then I really understood what we had done and what I agreed to do, and I was on board 100%. I didn't see it like other people did. I didn't see it being successful. I saw Grant and I on the corner giving away books with free bowls of soup. I really did. I literally asked the publisher the dimensions of a box of books so I could measure in my garage for some place to put these, and I was wrong, and everybody else was right, and I am grateful for it. So let's go ahead and start wrapping up. It's been like 32 minutes.
Yeah, I do want to. So some few things that I do notice is some hard truths, and is that one, there's two routes you can go. You can go the typical route, which is through an agent and a publisher. They really care about one thing, which is demand and selling books. You can truly have a great story.
Yeah,
which is okay. That's their role. That's their role. Because you do get a lot of people who come up to you who are prior service, who maybe served in Vietnam or some war or some theater or some service, or Secret Service, and they have an incredible amount. They have incredible stories. I mean, edge of your seat stories. But the publisher will turn around and say, "Okay, well, who's going to buy the book?" And you'll be like, like anybody would love to hear the story. This is amazing."
Exactly,
but it's truly
what said to us.
Yeah, but it's really demand driven. So if you have followers, if you have a blog, if you already have a social media presence, that helps their algorithms essentially crunch those numbers for them and make their decisions. If you're a nobody and you're not a Navy SEAL, and that's kind of even being oversaturated, and they're really going to hammer you on the demand thing, and then you have to ask yourself, why are you writing this, even if it's not going to have a big splash? And in your case, you did it. You eventually you got the advice from someone, and you took it to heart that this was really about the catharsis. That it was like therapy for you.
So a good friend of ours came to me and said, "Listen, I want you to do this for, if no other reason, is you're an angry guy." And what he meant by that is, when we were together hunting or whatever, and at the end
you're
of the
less
day,
angry now than you were then.
I am less. I'm always going to be an angry guy, but I'm less angry. Listen, I got a chance to tell my side of the story, and it wasn't about my side of the story for me. It was about my coworker side of the story. We were Secret Service Uniform Division officers who took a polygraph to get where they were, who lived these stellar, clean lives, and were attacked because the President of the United States couldn't curtail his behavior. A White House intern couldn't curtail her bad behavior and forced herself into a place. It blew up in everybody's face. they got what they asked for, and everybody else got what they didn't ask for. And I wanted to tell my side of the story, which told my coworker side of the story. Now, don't get me wrong. All my coworkers don't agree with what I did, and that's their opinion, and I can live with it, and they will too. So basically, my last say on this is define your story. Just decide to yourself and talk this out loud with yourself and somebody else. Why is it I want to tell this? If you want to tell it just to make money, then stop wasting your time, because you won't be able to sell it. If you want to tell your story because you want to help other people and you want to get the message out of what right and wrong is, that's your story. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and let Grant close us out.
Yeah, the last thing I'm going to say is, with publishers, they have this really bizarre thing that we had to deal with, which is they want a juicy, salacious, something that'll make headlines kind of story, and something that's never been heard before. So they want every news outlet and such, they want the exclusives. So so you have to have a story that has demand, is juicy, has never been heard before, and yet the politics of it is they want it to be corroborated. So how do you write something that no one's ever heard before and yet is corroborated? So any evidence that you have from the past, the pictures, the statements, the news clippings, the people that will vouch for you, you would sign several legal affidavits, saying that all the liability, for defamation and stuff is on you, that the publisher doesn't take any responsibility of that you're of sound mind and judgment,
Yep.
that kind of whole thing, literally. And that's a really big pickle. And so if you can navigate all those things, then writing is for you. But I totally 100% agree with you. And I gotta say, I've seen an incredible change in you from this whole thing. Because I think writing has been an incredible source of alleviation of all those burdens that you were sort of carrying with you. And I think that in and of itself makes the whole writing process worth it.
I wouldn't trade it for the world. And again, I'm going to publicly say thank you to you.
And thank you to you.
No problem. All right.
And thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. Yeah. This has been the Crisis of Character podcast with Gary Byrne, and in this case with me too. Please, we're going to be doing more of these. We've now figured out the format that works best for us, so expect to see more of these. Like and subscribe.
Can you tell about before we actually hang up, could you do about the social media? We have a
yes. Follow Gary Byrne on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Easiest way to get in contact with Gary for media interviews and such is going to be through Facebook. I monitor it 24/7. So that's going to be the quickest way. And it's quarantine time, so it's easy to get hold of him. He's available via Skype. He now has a new headset. Secrets of the Secret Service and Crisis of Character are available wherever books are sold. Thank you guys so much for watching.
Thanks.